The beginning. The rain came down in silver sheets, lashing against the bus windows, as Grace hugged her coat tighter around her. The route was supposed to take her all the way to Bar Harbor, but a detour sign had rerouted them through a fog-covered back road that wasn't on the map. Just her luck. Grace sighed and looked out at the blur of pine trees and shadowy cliffs. She'd been chasing quiet, not storms. She wasn't running from anyone, not really, just from the weight of expectations, from a city that never made space for her softness, her sighs, her stillness, from a world that treated curvy women like background noise. She wanted somewhere to breathe. That's when she saw it. A wooden sign barely visible through the fog, the letters carved in faded gold. Welcome to Thornchapel established. The rest of the day was worn away. The bus hissed to a stop. Looks like we're taking a break, the driver muttered. Town's got an inn and a diner. Be back in 30. Grace stepped down into the mist and instantly felt it. Something in the air, like the hush of a library just before a secret is revealed. Thornchapel was small, quaint, all cobblestone streets, old gas lamps, and storefronts with ivy crawling up the bricks. And in the distance, perched like a crown on the edge of a cliff, stood a building that made her breath catch. A library. Grace didn't remember seeing it on the travel pamphlet. She didn't care. Her boots splashed through puddles as she walked toward it, drawn like the tide. The moment she touched the wrought iron gate, it opened with a soft creak. Inside, the library smelled of salt and stories, leather-bound tomes, old wood, and something deeper. Magic, maybe. She wouldn't have believed that before. But now, she wasn't so sure. She wandered past rows of shelves until she found a room at the back. Warm, lit by a fireplace. And that's where she saw him. He was shelving books, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of chestnuts, and a quiet steadiness to his movements. His eyes flicked up, catching hers, and held. Didn't expect company today, he said, his voice deep and low like a cello. I didn't expect to find this place, Grace replied, smoothing her coat, suddenly aware of how damp her curls were, how her curves filled the doorway. The storm brought me here. He smiled, just slightly. Thornchapel has a way of finding people when they need it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said the first honest thing that came to her. It feels like this place was waiting. He stepped closer, eyes kind. Maybe it was. Grace had never believed in fate. But when he looked at her like that, like she mattered, like her size wasn't something to look past but something to see, she felt something shift. As if the story of her life had just turned a page. Chapter 2. The fire crackled softly behind them as Grace stood in the doorway, the stranger watching her like he already knew how the next chapter of her life would read. She usually hated being looked at for too long. All her life, stares meant judgment, whispers, assumptions. But this was different. He looked at her like she was familiar, like she'd been dreamed before. I'm Elias, he said finally, his voice warm but reserved, as if testing how much to say. Grace, she replied. Grace, he repeated, like it meant something to him. She hesitated, glancing at the walls of books. You live here. I take care of the library, he said, but the town takes care of itself. People come and go. Most don't find Thornchapel unless they need it. I didn't need anything, she said quietly. I was supposed to be headed to Bar Harbor. He nodded but said nothing. Grace tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. And the storm just dropped me off here. That's what storms do. They wash away what no longer fits. His words stirred something in her, something she didn't want to name. He motioned toward a wingback chair near the fire. "You're welcome to stay a while." "I only have 30 minutes, she said, sitting despite herself. "The driver said to be back by then." Elias tilted his head. "There's no clock in Thornchapel. Time moves how it wants." She let out a small laugh, surprised by how easily it came. "That sounds convenient." "It can be," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "But it also means things happen when they're meant to. Not always when you want them to." Grace looked into the fire, feeling its warmth settle into her shoulders. She didn't know why she wasn't panicking. Maybe because she didn't have anywhere else to be. Not really. Maybe because it was the first time in a long while someone offered her a place, without asking her to shrink first. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Number. But I've always belonged here." She thought about that for a moment. Belonging. It was such a fragile word. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old windows. The storm wasn't done yet. "I think the bus might be delayed," she said softly. He smiled. "Then I guess you'll be here a while." She nodded, unsure whether she should be nervous or relieved. A soft creak echoed through the hall. Grace turned her head, but no one was there. Elias stood slowly. "Sometimes the library finds books before you do. Follow me." She rose, brushing her hands along the arms of the chair, and followed him into the main corridor. The scent of old parchment thickened as they walked, and the firelight faded behind them. Elias stopped at the center of the library. A single book sat on a pedestal beneath a stained glass window. The cover was leather, dark red. No dust, no title. Grace stepped closer, her heart picking up pace. Her name was written on the spine. She reached for it. "I didn't write this," she whispered. Elias's voice was quiet behind her. "Not yet." Chapter 3. Grace stared at the book like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. The leather was smooth, warm under her fingertips. Her name was etched into the spine in gold script. Not just her first name, her full name, middle name included. The one she never used. She looked back at Elias. "This is a trick, right?" He didn't move. "The library doesn't play tricks. It only tells the truth. Even when you're not ready to read it." She opened the book. The pages were blank, at first. Then, in delicate black ink, words began to form across the top of the first page, as if being written by an invisible hand. Chapter 1. The Storm. Her heart thudded. Beneath the title, the book described her train detour, the bus ride, the rain, the smell of salt in the air. It even described the curl of her hair sticking to her cheek, and the words she'd said to Elias when she first arrived. Grace flipped to the next page. More of her thoughts, her feelings, her exact actions in the library, moments that had just happened. She closed the book with trembling hands. "This is impossible." Elias finally moved, stepping forward. "Not here." She looked up at him. "Is this what you meant by time moves differently?" He nodded. "This book is yours. It only writes what you live. Sometimes it hints at what's to come. Sometimes it warns." She took a step back, clutching the book to her chest. "Why me?" Elias met her gaze. "Because Thornchapel called you. The town only appears for those whose stories are about to change, those who matter." She shook her head. "I'm not anyone special." "Yes, you are." The words fell so naturally from his lips that it made her chest tighten. She'd heard kindness before. Politeness. pity even. But this felt different. He wasn't flattering her. He wasn't trying to fix her. He believed it, like she was already something whole, not something waiting to be improved. He looked down at the book. It showed up an hour before you arrived. The library always knows. Grace stepped away from the pedestal, the book still in her arms. I don't want my life written down. I just wanted to disappear for a while. You didn't disappear, Grace, he said. You were found. She didn't know how to answer that. Lightning flashed beyond the stained glass windows. The thunder rolled over the cliffs and shook the walls. The storm's not letting up, Elias said. You shouldn't go out in it. Grace hesitated. I don't want to miss the bus. You won't, he said softly. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. There was something about the way he said it that made her feel it could be true. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for someone to change her or explain her worth. She just was. She looked back at the library, the warm firelight, the shelves whispering with stories. The man who had looked at her like he'd been waiting his whole life for her to walk through the door, and the book that had already begun writing their next chapter. Chapter 4. Grace sat curled in the reading chair once more, the book balanced on her lap. A blanket had appeared, soft, thick, and smelling faintly of cedar, and she didn't question it. Not anymore. Thornchapel seemed to know what people needed before they asked. The words on the pages no longer surprised her. They described her feelings in ways she hadn't even admitted to herself. Quiet longing, deep fatigue, a craving for something real, something lasting. Each sentence read like a gentle mirror. Elias returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea. Chamomile and honey, he said, offering her one. It settles nerves and memories. She accepted it carefully, their fingers brushed. Do you do this often? She asked. Take care of travelers passing through. Only the ones meant to stay, he said. Her gaze flicked to his face. And how do you know which ones those are? He took the seat across from her again. They're the ones who stop running when the town finds them. Grace stared into her mug, letting the warmth seep into her hands. I haven't stopped. Not really. I don't even know what I'm running from. You'll know when it stops chasing you. His calm made her feel steadier, more rooted, like she could breathe in her body for the first time in years. She wasn't trying to shrink herself in the chair. She wasn't tugging at her sleeves to cover her arms. She wasn't apologizing for taking up space. Elias saw her, all of her, and not once had he looked away. She finally asked the question sitting on the tip of her mind. Are you like the town too? He tilted his head. What do you mean? You said the town appears when people need it. Do you appear when people need you? A slow, quiet smile curved his lips. Something like that. There was no arrogance in his voice, no teasing, just truth. She studied him. Who needed you last? He was silent for a beat too long. Then carefully he said, No one. Not for a long time. That tugged at something inside her, a deep loneliness that mirrored her own. She'd spent years being surrounded by people, yet feeling completely unseen. But this wasn't loneliness. It was waiting. Do you live alone? She asked. I'm not alone anymore. She blinked, caught off guard by the way he looked at her when he said it. A crack of thunder made the library windows tremble. Grace stood, moving instinctively toward them. The fog had thickened. The street outside was barely visible. No lights from the inn, no sign of the bus. It's like the town is closed off, she murmured. Elias joined her by the window. It's not closed. It's listening. Listening to what? To see if you'll stay. Grace turned toward him slowly. And what happens if I do? His voice lowered. Then the real story begins. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But her pulse quickened. And somewhere in the heart of the library, a page turned all on its own. Chapter 5. The wind howled against the library walls as if something outside was desperate to get in, or something inside was tempting it closer. But within the library's stone walls, there was only calm, warmth, and a sense that Grace had stepped out of time altogether. She sat at the long reading table now, the red book still in front of her. Elias had disappeared momentarily to tend to something downstairs, though she wasn't quite sure what that meant. This place didn't feel like it had a basement, more like it stretched downward into older stories no one had dared open in years. She flipped the book open again. The new chapter had already begun. Chapter 5. The Wolf. Grace paused. Her eyes traced the first paragraph. It described her standing by the window with Elias, the way his gaze had lingered on her, the way her heart had responded. And then in ink that seemed to shimmer faintly. He is more than just the librarian. He is the guardian of Thornchapel. Its memory, its teeth. Grace's breath caught. She turned the page, but the next one was blank again. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her. When she looked up, Elias had returned, but he looked different. Not physically, no dramatic transformation. But there was something in his eyes now, a depth, a silence too still to be human. "You read it," he said quietly. She nodded. "You knew I would." He didn't deny it. Grace stood. "You're a shifter." "Yes." "And I'm my mate." The words felt between them with the weight of truth. Grace's throat tightened. "I don't even know what that means." "It means the moment I saw you, I knew. The bond is ancient, unbreakable. It's not about what you look like or where you're from. It's about the rhythm of your soul. And mine." She sat again, kneading the ground beneath her. "But I didn't feel anything, not at first." "You felt safe, seen, like you could rest." Elias's voice softened. "That's what the bond offers first. Peace. The pull comes later. The need." Grace let out a shaky breath. "You said people only find this down when their story's about to change. Is this the change?" Elias looked at her with a gaze so steady it almost hurt. "You are the change." She didn't know what to do with that. All her life, people had tried to change her. Her shape, her voice, her dreams. She'd been told to blend in, to be smaller, quieter. And now, this man, this wolf, was telling her she was the turning point. "I don't know how to be someone's mate," she said honestly. "You don't have to know," he replied. "You just have to choose." Outside, the storm began to die down. The wind stilled, the fog thinned, and from somewhere deep in the library, the sound of howling rose. Not violent, not frightening, mourning, longing. A call to something she hadn't known lived inside her. Grace pressed her hand to the red book's cover. It felt warm, alive. She looked up. "If I stay, what happens next?" Elias didn't smile this time. He bowed his head slightly, like a vow. "If you stay, you'll find out who you've always been." Chapter 6. Morning broke slowly in Thornchapel. The fog pulled back like a curtain, revealing a sky brushed with soft gray and hints of pale blue. Grace stood at the balcony that overlooked the sea, wrapped in a shawl Elias had offered her the night before. The air was crisp and cool, the kind that whispered of change. She hadn't slept, not because of fear, but because her mind wouldn't stop turning. Mate. It wasn't a word she'd ever associated with herself. It sounded primal, wild, like something out of a myth. And yet she didn't feel unsafe. She didn't feel trapped. She felt chosen. Below, the town began to stir. The lights in the bakery flickered on. A man swept the front step of the apothecary. A child darted across the road, chasing a bird through the morning mist. Thornchapel was real, even if it didn't exist on any map she'd ever seen. Elias joined her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You didn't sleep," he said. She took the mug and smiled faintly. "Neither did you." "I didn't want to miss anything," she glanced at him. "Like what?" "Like the moment you decide to stay." Grace sipped the tea to hide the way her chest fluttered. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "That's the thing about Thornchapel," he said. "You don't come here because you're ready. You come because you're needed. And because you're more than ready, you're worthy." She stared into her cup, the words sinking deeper than she expected. Her whole life had been a careful balancing act. Don't want too much, don't take up too much space, don't speak too loudly. But Elias had never flinched at her presence. Not once. In fact, he seemed grounded by it, like she was the stillness he'd been searching for. "You said the town writes stories," she said. "That the book only records what I live." He nodded. "Then I want to live something worth reading." He looked at her for a long time. "You already are." Grace let the silence stretch, the wind curling around them gently. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't on a deadline, or behind on something, or apologizing just for existing. She was just here, and it felt right. Down below, the red book waited, and somewhere beneath the cliffs, the wolves were quiet now, watching, waiting. "What happens if I leave?" she asked. Elias didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "The town will disappear, the book will close, and I'll wait again, however long it takes." Her throat tightened. "That sounds lonely." "It's only lonely," he said gently, "when the right person walks away." Grace set down her mug. Her hand brushed against his. Warm, familiar, steady. "I think I need one more day," she whispered. Elias turned to her fully. "Then we make today count." And with that, they walked back into the library together, the door closing behind them, not with finality, but with a promise. Because Thornchapel didn't trap people. It gave them a choice. And Grace had just taken the first step toward her own story. Chapter 7. The red book had moved again. Grace found it on a side table in the reading room, sitting beneath a shaft of sunlight that had broken through the clouds. It was still open to her story. A new page had begun. Chapter 7. The Turning. She ran her fingers down the edge of the paper, letting the moment settle over her like a tide. Something had shifted the night before. Something quiet but irreversible. She hadn't made a dramatic choice, hadn't declared herself, but she'd stayed. And Thornchapel noticed. The town felt different in the light, still mysterious, still strange, but gentler, as if it had taken a deep breath along with her, as if it had decided to meet her halfway. She wandered to the back of the library, where shelves curved in a perfect circle around a spiral staircase. She hadn't explored this part yet. Elias had told her the deeper levels held older books, histories of Thornchapel, and tales of other people who had come before. As she descended the stairs, a familiar sound greeted her, low and steady breathing. Elias stood at the bottom, examining a scroll laid across a long oak table. He didn't look up. You found it, he said, sensing her presence. I followed the pull, she said. He smiled at that. That's how most people find their truth here. What is this? She asked, stepping closer. These are stories of past arrivals, he explained. Other visitors the town brought here. Most of them never knew why they were chosen, but their lives changed all the same. Grace peered at the scroll. Names, dates, destinies. Do they all become like you? No, he said. Some heal, some stay, some simply need to remember who they are. Thornchapel gives them what they need, not always what they want. She touched the edge of the scroll. And what do I need? You're still discovering that. She looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were golden brown in the daylight, not glowing, not animalistic, just steady, trusting, familiar. Do you remember the first time you shifted? She asked. He nodded slowly. It was here. The town gave me back the part of me I had hidden for too long. And you stayed. He met her eyes. I stayed because Thornchapel asked me to protect it. But I remained, because I hoped it would one day bring you. Grace's breath caught. There was no dramatic music, no flash of light, just truth, plain and powerful. I've spent so long being afraid of being too much, she whispered. Too loud, too heavy, too emotional, too everything. You're not too much, Elias said. You're just right. She felt something open inside her, something she'd kept locked away for far too long. I don't know what I'm becoming, she said, but I don't want to become it alone. Elias stepped forward. Then don't. The wolves howled in the distance again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a welcome. The book upstairs turned a page, and Grace knew, deep in her bones, that she was no longer just a visitor in someone else's story. She was the author now. Chapter 8. Later that afternoon, Grace found herself wandering the town square. It wasn't large, just a circle of cobbled streets bordered by old storefronts and lantern posts that flickered even in daylight. The people of Thornchapel moved like the town itself, slowly, deliberately, with a kind of unspoken awareness, as if they all knew they were living in a place meant to be remembered. A woman with soft white curls and a green apron waved at Grace from behind the bakery counter. A child skipped by holding a wooden wolf figurine. The shop signs were in English, but there was something older behind the words, as if the town had translated itself just enough for Grace to understand. She stopped at a bench and took in the view. From this angle, she could see the edge of the cliffs. The sea glittered far below. Waves crashed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Grace didn't recognize herself. Not in a bad way. She felt lighter, not smaller. She was still the same woman, the same body, the same curves. But something heavy had slipped from her shoulders, something invisible, but real. She heard footsteps approach behind her. I thought I'd find you here, Elias said, sitting beside her. How? The town keeps watch. So do I. Grace gave him a small smile. Is that your way of saying you're always one step behind me? No, he said gently. It's my way of saying I'll never be too far if you need me. She didn't answer right away. Then, the book called this chapter The Turning. What do you think it means? He looked out at the sea. Every fated story has a point where the path branches. You're standing at yours. She nodded slowly, letting that settle. And if I choose to leave? Then you'll take a piece of Thornchapel with you, but the door might not open again. Not for a long time. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. The air was cooler now. I've spent so much time choosing what's safe, what's familiar, what won't make people stare. Elias looked over at her. And? I'm tired of playing small. I want something wild, honest, big. You want to live. Grace turned to face him. Yes, I do. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, just looked at her with that same quiet reverence that undid her defenses one thread at a time. And then he said, then stay. Write your story. Let Thornchapel remember you. She took a breath and looked out at the waves again. Her pulse was steady, her heart calm. For once, she wasn't waiting for permission. I think I will. At that moment, a bell rang from the direction of the library. Not a warning, a celebration. The town had heard her choice, and the book upstairs turned another page. Chapter 9. The sun dipped low over Thornchapel, casting golden light across the rooftops and painting the sea in shades of fire and rose. Grace walked beside Elias in silence, their steps slow, steady, unhurried. There was no rush in this town, no looming deadline. Time here flowed like honey, sweet, patient, and full of meaning. As they approached the library, its familiar silhouette rising like a cathedral of stories, Elias stopped just outside the iron gate. There's something I want to show you, he said. He led her along a path that curved behind the building, through a garden she hadn't noticed before. Thorn trees lined the edges, their branches tangled with blooms in shades of ivory and violet. In the center stood a small stone structure, half forgotten, half sacred. What is this place? She asked. A memory, Elias replied, of those who chose to stay. He pushed the old wooden door open, and inside was a wall lined with names carved in delicate script. Some were new, others had softened with time, their edges worn smooth. Grace stepped closer. In the center of the wall, one section was bare, waiting. Everyone who finds themselves in Thornchapel leaves a mark, Elias said behind her. Some stay and become part of the town. Others leave, but their story stays behind. This is where we remember them. She ran her fingers across the empty stone, her breath catching. Will my name go here? When the story is ready to be told, he said softly. They left the little sanctuary and walked back up the garden path. The stars were beginning to show, and above them the town exhaled, its magic humming quietly in the wind. Back inside the library, the fire was already lit. Grace crossed the reading room, the familiar red book sitting open on the table. This time she didn't hesitate. She turned the page. Chapter 9. The Choice. The chapter wasn't long, just a few sentences, a promise written in clean, sure lines. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she realized she belonged. Her story had always been leading here. She just needed to be brave enough to claim it. Grace smiled. She looked at Elias. You said Thornchapel gives people what they need. What do you need? He paused for a moment, then answered honestly, I needed someone who would stay. Not out of obligation, but out of love. I needed someone who would see me as more than the role I was given. She nodded, and I needed to see myself through someone else's eyes. Not smaller, not broken, just enough. Elias stepped closer. You were always enough, Grace. She closed the book. Then let's see what comes next. They stood together in the center of the library, the firelight glowing around them, the past and future wrapped into the stillness of now. Outside, Thornchapel settled in for the night, and somewhere deep in its heart, the final page of this chapter sealed itself, etched into memory, into magic, into the walls of a town that would never forget her. Chapter 10. The rain had returned by nightfall. Gentle this time. It tapped against the windows like a lullaby, the rhythm slow and soft. Inside the library, the fire crackled low. Grace stood by the hearth, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the red book closed beside her on the table. Elias was near, his presence quiet but electric. He hadn't touched her, not really. Not since that first accidental brush of hands, that first long look. But the space between them had shifted. The air was heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Grace turned toward him. "Do you always wait this long?" she asked, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. He was standing by the tall window, arms crossed loosely, but at her words he looked up, like she'd called something to attention deep inside him. "I wait," he said carefully, "until I know she's choosing me. Not the mystery, not the town. Me." She stepped closer. The firelight danced against her skin, softening every edge. She was barefoot, her curls still damp from earlier, and her body wrapped in soft, earth-toned fabrics that followed the lines of her hips and thighs. She didn't hide her figure now. Not from him. "I've been chosen for so many things," she whispered, "as long as I was willing to shrink, to adjust, to apologize." He moved to her, slow and sure, stopping just inches away. "You never have to shrink here," he said. "Not your body, not your voice, not your dreams." Her chest rose with a slow inhale. "Then what do you see when you look at me?" He didn't touch her, but his gaze moved across her like a vow. "I see strength wrapped in softness," he said. "I see beauty that holds its own space. I see a woman whose presence calms storms and stirs something in me I've spent years burying." Grace's eyes stung with the weight of it. She'd always feared she was too much, too emotional, too big, too everything. But here, with him, she felt like a universe, finally allowed to expand. He reached for her hand. She gave it freely, their fingers twined together, the warmth of his skin grounding her. She stepped into his arms. His hands came to rest at the small of her back, one wide palm over the curve of her waist, the other at her shoulder. Not controlling, not guiding, just there, holding. Her forehead pressed to his chest, and for a moment, they just stood that way, breathing the same air, listening to the fire, the rain, the silence that stretched around them like a blessing. When she finally tilted her head back to meet his gaze, he was already looking down at her, eyes gentle, lips parted slightly, like he'd been holding back something tender. "I'm not fragile," she said quietly. "I know. And I'm not unfinished." "You're breathtaking," he said. And then slowly he bent to kiss her. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't rushed. It was a kiss like a story unfolding, reverent, deep, and full of meaning. His lips moved with a softness that made her knees tremble, and his arms pulled her closer as if anchoring them both to the moment. Grace melted into it, into him. Her hands rose to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and he breathed her name like a prayer. They stayed there, wrapped in each other, as the storm outside whispered on. Nothing about the moment felt small, because love wasn't small, and neither was she. Chapter 11. Morning came quietly, the rain having finally spent itself sometime in the night. Thornchapel was bathed in silver mist and early light, its rooftops softened by dew, the sea calm beyond the cliffs. Grace awoke not in a stranger's bed, not in a borrowed space, but nestled on the velvet couch in the reading room, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and the lingering warmth of last night's embrace. Elias sat nearby, sipping tea and watching the fire. He hadn't gone far. He never did. For a moment, she didn't move. She watched him in the flickering light, the way his shoulders rose and fell with each slow breath, the curve of his profile, the quiet stillness that wrapped around him like it belonged. She didn't know how long she had been watching when he finally spoke. "Did you sleep?" Grace stretched beneath the blanket. Eventually, "You looked peaceful." "I felt peaceful." She sat up slowly, pushing her curls from her eyes. Her body still hummed with warmth, not from anything that had happened, but from what hadn't been rushed, from the trust, from the way he'd held her like he had all the time in the world. "I've never seen the way you look at me," she said softly. Elias turned toward her fully. "You've always been worthy of that gaze. You just haven't been given it before." She stood and crossed the room. Her long cardigan swayed around her legs, and she didn't flinch at the way the fabric clung to her curves. "Not anymore. Not here." He rose too, setting his mug aside. "You're not just a moment to me, Grace," he said. "You're a chapter I've waited years to read." She laughed quietly. "You and your book metaphors." He reached for her hand, brushing his fingers lightly over her knuckles. "The stories we tell matter, and the ones we believe about ourselves. Those are the most dangerous, or the most powerful." Grace nodded slowly. "I'm learning that." They stood together in the golden hush of the morning. Outside, the town stirred to life. Soft footsteps on stone, the distant clink of teacups, the caw of a lone bird overhead. But inside, it was just the two of them. A woman who had never been allowed to take up space, and a wolf who had waited his entire life for the space she now filled. She looked at the red book on the table. "What does it say today?" she asked. Elias reached for it, opening the cover. A new page had begun. Chapter 11, The Becoming. He read aloud. She woke not as a visitor, but as someone changed. The town no longer felt temporary. The bond no longer felt mysterious. She was no longer on the edge of something. She was inside it, at the center, a part of the story now, and no longer afraid of the weight of her name. Grace blinked against the sting in her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she said. Elias closed the book. "Then don't." She looked up at him, her voice steady. "I want to know everything. I want to help. I want to stay in this town that sees people the way they are, not the way the world tells them to be." Elias smiled, not the reserved, cautious smile she'd first seen, but something fuller now, brighter. "Then welcome home, Grace." And in the heart of Thornchapel, the book wrote one more line. She had finally turned the page. Chapter 12. Grace spent the next few days learning the rhythm of Thornchapel. It didn't rush her. The town flowed at her pace, bending gently around her presence like it had always been waiting. The bakery sent warm scones to the library every morning. The florist left wildflowers at the front steps without ever being seen. Children passed her on the streets and greeted her by name. She hadn't told them, but they knew. Elias explained it simply. The town remembers who belongs. And Grace was beginning to believe she did. She shelved books, explored corridors she hadn't noticed before, and found corners of the library lit by skylights that seemed to glow only when she walked past. She wore her softest clothes, let her curls fall freely, and stopped apologizing with her eyes when she laughed too loudly. One afternoon, she stepped into the mirror room, a quiet space, lined with glass that reflected not just her image, but her energy. She stared at her reflection, Full hips, wide shoulders, strong arms, thick thighs. A body built like the women in paintings. Rounded, radiant, powerful. She didn't look away. I used to flinch at mirrors, she said aloud. Elias stood in the doorway behind her. What do you see now? Grace turned to face him. A woman who finally feels whole. He stepped closer, his reflection joining hers. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. She looked back at the mirror, her voice quiet. I was told so many times that I had to earn love, that I had to make up for how I looked. And now? Now I know I never had to earn what I already deserved. Elias reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You're not just enough, Grace. You're extraordinary. They stood in the mirror room for a long time, watching the reflections shimmer in the light, two souls no longer waiting for permission to exist. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the golden haze returned, Grace sat with Elias on the library steps. The town stretched before them, aglow with lanterns and the soft hum of evening. You know, she said, I used to think the best parts of me were too hidden for anyone to find. Elias turned to her. And now? Now I think I was just waiting for the right eyes to see them. He smiled. Thornchapel didn't just find you, he said. It found me again, too. The wolves howled in the hills. The red book turned another page. And in the quiet between night and story, a new chapter waited, ready to begin. Chapter 13. The next morning, the sea fog clung low and thick over Thornchapel. Everything looked softer, like a watercolor painting not yet dry. Grace stood at the edge of the cliffs behind the library, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, her curls loose in the breeze. She could hear the town waking slowly behind her, the clang of a bell, the creak of a cart wheel, a quiet laugh echoing down the lane. But here, above the sea, it was still. Elias stood beside her. She didn't need to hear his footsteps anymore to know when he was near. She just felt it, like the air changed when he was close, like something inside her realigned. You're thinking again, he said, his voice a gentle rumble. I do that a lot, she replied with a half smile. What about this time? She hesitated. The other versions of me, the ones who stayed quiet, the ones who let the world decide their worth. He waited. I think she's still in there, Grace said, but she's not in charge anymore. Elias looked out toward the fog. We all carry old versions of ourselves. But when you stopped running, you told her she didn't have to be afraid anymore. Grace nodded. The wind brushed against her cheeks, and for once, she didn't shy away from it. She let the air touch her, let the morning hold her exactly as she was. I never thought I'd belong somewhere, she said. You don't belong somewhere, Grace. You belong to yourself. She turned to him. And to you. Elias didn't smile this time. His eyes were steady. Only if you say so. She looked at him, really looked. The way his broad shoulders softened when he stood near her. The way he spoke to her like she was sacred. The way he never asked her to be anything other than what she already was. I do, she said. He stepped forward, close enough that their foreheads nearly touched. Then everything that I am, I offer to you. Grace closed her eyes and breathed him in. Warmth, pine, home. The fog began to lift. And when she opened her eyes again, the cliffs below revealed something she hadn't seen before. A pattern of stones laid out in the shape of a spiral. A mark, a symbol. The town is changing, she whispered. Elias nodded. It always does when someone chooses to stay. She took his hand. Together, they walked back toward the library, the morning sun piercing through the last tendrils of mist. And as the town shimmered in the light, Grace felt something shift inside her. Not a beginning, not an ending, but a becoming. Chapter 14, the end. The day Grace decided to stay, the town bloomed. It wasn't loud or sudden, but the shift was undeniable. The cobblestones grew warmer beneath her feet. The scent of lilac and honey lingered longer in the air. The tides pulled closer at the cliffs at dusk. And the wolves, once just howls in the distance, began to appear in shadows and between trees, their eyes watchful, respectful, as if nodding to the one who had finally claimed her place. Grace found herself walking different paths each day, but always ending up in the same place, at the library, where the red book lived and Elias waited with quiet certainty. She still didn't know everything about him. His past was a map drawn in fading ink, little clues and fragments tucked between the lines of their conversations. But what she did know was more important. He was hers, and she was his. Not because of a magical mark or fated bond, but because they chose each other, every morning, every glance, every time their hands met across the book or over the garden table. On the 7th day, a new name appeared on the memory wall. Grace Alana Martin. The carving shimmered for a moment when she touched it, like the stone itself had acknowledged her. She didn't cry, but only because the air held her so gently. It felt like the town was already doing it for her. Elias stood behind her that day, just watching, letting her feel it all without interruption. His respect for her space was something she had grown to cherish. He was always near, never pushing, always there when she needed him, and trusting her when she needed time alone. That evening, they sat by the fire in the reading room, books scattered on the floor, their tea long since forgotten. Grace leaned against his side, legs curled beneath her, the heat of the hearth soft against her skin. "I used to hate silence," she said. "It reminded me of being ignored." Elias turned his head, his cheek resting against her curls. "And now? Now it reminds me that I'm finally being listened to." He didn't respond with words. He just reached down and took her hand, pressing it gently between both of his. The red book sat open on the table, a blank page glowing softly in the firelight. "Do you think it's really magic?" she asked, her voice low. Elias smiled. "The book," she nodded. "I think the magic isn't in the book. It's in the decision to write your life instead of just read it." She let that sit with her for a long time. "What would have happened if I'd never come to Thornchapel?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes warm. "I think the town would have waited." "And you?" "I would have waited too, until the stars burned out if I had to." Grace blinked back, sting in her eyes. She had never been anyone's reason to wait before. Later that night, the wolves gathered just beyond the cliffs. Grace saw them from the tower window, 6, maybe 7, watching the moon. One of them turned toward her, its eyes catching the starlight, and nodded once before vanishing into the trees. She asked Elias about it the next morning. "They recognize you now," he said simply. "Why?" "Because you don't just belong to me. You belong to the land. You were chosen by more than fate." He placed a hand on her lower back as they stood by the herb garden. "You stayed when you could have run. You believed when you had every reason to doubt. That matters here." And it did. She could feel it. The town had begun changing around her, adapting to her presence like a heartbeat syncing to a new rhythm. A tea shop opened beside the bakery. The library gained a new wing, one she hadn't seen before but somehow had always existed. People came in search of books she instinctively knew how to find. Children called her Miss Grace, and no one ever made her feel like she didn't belong in the space she took up. Even her reflection began to feel different. Not because her body changed, but because the way she carried it did. She stood taller. She stopped apologizing with her eyes. She stopped thinking of her softness as something to be corrected. She was Grace. She was enough. One afternoon, while dusting a forgotten shelf in the west corridor of the library, she found a mirror tucked behind an old tapestry. Not just a mirror, the mirror. It shimmered faintly, like it remembered her from the first day. She stepped in front of it. This time, her reflection didn't shift. It held steady. A full-bodied woman with rich curls, flushed cheeks, strong arms, and eyes that no longer held fear. She was not an idea. She was not a project. She was hers. And so was this life. That night, as the sun set in shades of rose gold and the sky faded to velvet, Elias met her by the cliffs again. The garden bloomed around them in wild color. Bees hovered lazily over lavender, and a fox watched them from the edge of the tree line. Elias took her hands in his. "The town has given me many things," he said. "A home, a purpose, quiet." He looked at her with something deeper than affection. "But it never gave me joy. Not until you." Grace felt the weight of his words wrap around her like a quilt, hand-stitched, intentional, warm. "And you gave me something too," she whispered. "What's that?" "Myself." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. Then, from his pocket, he drew a small object wrapped in velvet. Grace raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" He unwrapped it slowly. A ring, simple and silver, with a tiny symbol etched into the band. "A story never truly ends," he said. "It becomes part of something bigger." Grace stared at the ring. It shimmered in the fading light like a secret waiting to be told. "I know you've just begun," Elias continued, "and I would never rush your pages. But if you choose it, I'd be honored to build the next chapter together." He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. He simply waited, offering. Grace reached out, her fingers curling around his. "You were never a chapter," she said. "You were the plot twist that saved the story." She slipped the ring onto her finger, and in that moment, Thornchapel bloomed again. The lanterns lit without flame. The wolves howled not with warning, but in harmony. The sea sang against the rocks below, as if even the tide was celebrating. They stood there for a long time, arms around each other, the story settling around them like fog and firelight. The red book, left open in the library, began writing again. Chapter 14. The End That Became a Beginning. She stayed, she became, and together they turned every quiet page into something eternal. Not because they were perfect, not because fate demanded it, but because they chose to love, openly, fully, without shrinking. And in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to belong. The end. Thank you for listening to this book.